The Nintendo 64, yes, the final system that I would consider retro before everything started to go mainstream with the graphics and analog controls and internet and everything going standard. I want to talk about it. It's going to be probably a long video. I have a lot to talk about with this system, so let's get right to it. Now, it's always good to start at the beginning, and that would be with the hype. This was the biggest hyped system, the most hyped system that I ever heard of in my life. It was all over video game magazines, commercials, and everything way before the system was ever even coming out. So I saw a double page spread of it for the very first time, and I think GamePro magazine, and they were calling it the Ultra 64 before they were calling it the Nintendo 64. And I always thought that was a better name anyway. I always thought that N64, Nintendo 64 sounded a bit too generic. I wish they had kept the Ultra 64 name. Now, there were also arcades at the time that were showing off some of the power of the system as well, such as that racing game and the Killer Instinct game as well. But Killer Instinct also came out on Super Nintendo, but we're gonna get into that. So it was all about the hype. Now, where I live, there is a place called Playland, and it's sort of just like one of those generic kind of carny places where you go. It's not really Disneyland, but you go there and you've got rides and stuff like that and all those games that you can play there and everything, and roller coasters and everything like that. It's very seasonal. But a little birdie told me in my ear that the Nintendo booth that they had there, now I say booth, it was more of like a circus, like big top area. It was a big Nintendo area. Nintendo leased it, and they would always show off their newest systems and newest games there all the time. Little birdie told me they had Nintendo 64 there, they had Mario being played there. You could go in there and you could play it. Well, that was it. I jumped in my car, I slammed on the gas, I went down there immediately. I bought my tickets to get in, didn't care about the rides or anything like that. I just went right to the Nintendo big top booth right away, and it was like tunnel vision, and I saw it. I saw the system. There were tons of them all inside. This was like a big area, right? So they had tons of TVs, Nintendo 64s, and they even had these big projector screens way up high so everyone could get a bird's eye view of what was getting played. And it was in the middle of a weekday. I don't know if I called in sick from work. I don't even remember. I don't even care. But the point is that I didn't have to wait in line or anything to play. There were systems that were free to play right away, and I ran right up to them and I grabbed the controller and I saw Mario in full glorious 3D jump out of one of those green pipes right away, and that was it. I tried to play for it as long as I could. So that was my very first experience with it. Mind was pretty blown. I was like, the graphics here, I mean, we've got anti-aliasing, it's so smooth. The very first time I felt Mario in full 3D, or any game for that matter, with an analog controller feel so flawlessly. You know, he could tiptoe, he could jog, he could do all those acrobatics in the air, the jumping, the grabbing, everything about it felt very, very, very good. I thought this was gonna be the greatest invention of mankind when this was finally gonna come out, because it was still, we had to wait a long time before it was coming out. But we're gonna get to that right now, because back in the day, Japanese systems, they were all from Japan, and when they were launching a new one, Japan would always get the systems before us. Canada, North America, Westerners, whatever, America, same thing, right? We had to wait a long time before we would get them. So what video game stores were doing, the private ones, because this was before GameStop, they were actually buying the Japanese versions and they were charging a markup for them, right? They would get very limited of them. They'll probably only get a handful of them at the most. And it wasn't crazy markup like it is today with the scalpers and everything, but it's kind of cool because I'm kind of foreshadowing what's kind of happening with Nintendo even today was sort of happening back in the day, except this was before eBay. But it wasn't crazy markup. It was only about $100 to $150 more than what you would pay for what the system would cost you to buy brand new anyway. So I had to travel hours out of the way because everyone was buying them up. I can't remember, it was like a 6-hour drive or something to some random video game store in some town I never even been to before. And he had one, we had a couple, but he had one left over for me that I pre-bought over the phone. And he had it, and I went down, got it, drove all the way back, opened it up, and it was Marathon. It was pure Mario Marathon. Even though I couldn't read the game, it was all in Japanese, it didn't matter. You didn't need to with Mario 64. It was incredible, and I got that same nostalgic feeling that I had when I bought my very first Nintendo as a kid and did the exact same marathon with the regular Super Mario Brothers. I got that again, and that everyone's always searching for that what do you call it, the chasing of the dragon, trying to search for that same nostalgic high that you got again. Well, I did get it with Mario 64, but I would never ever get it again. That was it. I think it just happens, you know, when you get older, you just don't get that feeling anymore. But I did get it with Mario 64. It was incredible. But because it was from Japan, there were no other games to get for it. That was the only one that I had, but it was marathon night and day with that game. So fast forward a little bit to the future when it did finally come out. Put my money down on it, traded in my Japanese one, got pretty good okay money for it, was almost an even swap for it, didn't cost me that much, got it, loved it. Now there were more games for it, not very many at the time, but we're gonna get into that. And I got Killer Instinct, and of course the system came with Mario. Now the problem was, and one of the biggest Achilles heels for the system, is that not only did they not have very many games at the launch, and everyone knows games make or break the system, they didn't have the companies anymore, okay? The Squares and the Konamis and the Capcoms and everything like that, they all migrated over to Sony, and Sony was doing fantastic. Sony had a massive library for the PlayStation at this time, and you know, let's face it, even games like Crash Bandicoot is no slouch either. So they're riding high in the hog, okay? You know, they got the Metal Gears, they've got the Final Fantasies, and they've got the Castlevanias. Even though there are Castlevania games for N64, they're total garbage, we all know that. So that was the problem with that they didn't have it. But the other big problem with the system I noticed is when I was playing it is that we were spoiled. I felt like I got spoiled because the Mario 64 is the best game on the whole system, and it was the system that came with it, okay, for free, and it was the very first one. There was years of development put into it. It was made by Nintendo, and Nintendo made sure that they would showcase everything that the system could do more or less flawlessly, where other companies that were making games for it always would say it was a difficult system to make anything on it. It was difficult to develop for. So that's why you got a lot of crappy games that are for N64, and there's quite a bit of them. And most of them, even if you would consider them okay titles, don't look or play nowhere near as good. Again, you could debate me on that, but it could be a personal opinion or not, that you could say, oh, games that came out later on, like Zelda and GoldenEye, and I'm going to talk about those, are better than Mario 64. I don't think they are. That's the greatest game that's on the whole system. They had everything. It's got the mascot that everyone loves. It's got the graphics. It's got the music. It's got great voiceovers on it. Mario does the woohoos and everything like that. In it, it's fantastic. So I didn't consider any single game that came out after it as good as it. So there was that, right? So let's talk about the system a bit, because there are some quirks about it, not too much about it, but one thing that Nintendo went for right away was they wanted to make it a cartridge-based system instead of a CD system. Now, why did they do that? Because Nintendo still is and always has been marketed for kids. It is a kids product, okay? Even though there are adults that do buy it, and I don't care if you're a Nintendo fan person, great, but they are, okay? They're not made for adults, they're made for kids. And Nintendo said, well, we don't think that children are responsible enough to have CD discs yet, because they can scratch them, they can break them, and we just don't, not only do we not want the kids to be unhappy, it's also gonna backlash, you know, back on us, maybe for warranty issues or possible production issues. So what they did was they said, we're gonna still make them cartridge because we've got the durability. Now the problem with that though is how much it costs to create them and produce them. So they passed that on to the consumer, and it was more expensive to buy Nintendo 64 cartridges than it was to buy, say, a PlayStation game. So they did that. There were still some advantages. You could still save, I think, some of your games on the cartridge, so you didn't need memory cards. But a quirky thing about the system is that it still does have memory cards on the N64, and I don't really know what for, because I guess their marketing was just like, well, you could take your save games and bring it over to your friend's house and something like that. But we didn't have that problem on Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. If it's save games on your cartridge, you just bring your game over to your friend's place and you got your save games, right? Now on to the controller. Yeah, this is one of the worst controllers there is out there, people. You know this. It's everybody knows this, okay? I'm not telling you anything new here. So when you hold the controller, the biggest problem Nintendo did was, I guess they didn't realize that most of their games would be played analog. They made the analog secondary, and they made the D-pad still in the number one area where it's supposed to be on the controller. They didn't switch them like they should have. So when you hold the controller, you kind of hold it on this weird, awkward angle, and it kind of makes your hands go all cripply, and it does hurt after a while, let me tell you. It does. And so when you push up really isn't up. It's more of like northwest, because you're on this crooked angle all the time. It doesn't feel good, and then it kind of it rubs against the back of your hands and stuff like that. It just doesn't. It's a really, really poor design on it. And it really is confusing to me that Nintendo didn't update the problem. That same controller is the same controller from the beginning of the system to the end of its lifespan. Very, very weird to me. It took aftermarket controllers later on that we have today to actually fix the problems with it as best they could. And another thing is the system actually came with 4 control ports on it, which was pretty cool. You didn't have to get an expansion for it at the time, even though there aren't that many games for it. There's a few games for it that are multiplayer, and it was cool for like a party type game, or maybe playing with your family and stuff like that. It also was not a big system, even though it looked like it was really big in the magazines. It really isn't when you look at it, and it's super solid. The reliability, I love the N64's construction. It's so solid, and there's no moving parts in it, kind of like how our new hard drives are nowadays compared to the old ones, where everything else, even PlayStation, you've got disk drives in it, you've got lasers and spinning discs and everything. There's too many moving parts into it. They're just not as reliable. You could pick up a Nintendo 64 out of the dump, or out of a garbage can or a landfill somewhere, and I guarantee you, if you just blew the dust out of it and plugged a game into it, I almost guarantee you it's gonna work. They're that solid of a system. So there is that. And it was kind of interesting to me how Nintendo made it so solid as opposed to the other systems. I don't know, I'm a geek like that. I like the construction of things. So I had the system, I was playing it, I was not playing it as often as I did. I had a few games for it. I didn't really buy many games for it when they were coming out, because I was still seeing that PlayStation was coming out, in my opinion, with better titles than it. They had the SNKs, and they had the Street Fighters and all that kind of stuff. And Killer Instinct was getting pretty boring to me. I'd already played the hell out of Mario on the Japanese version, so it wasn't really that great to me on the westernized version. But the thing that really killed it in my mind is when I started to see my cousins and my friends playing PC games with new graphics cards that were coming out. This was a whole new thing at the time, people, and with the GL graphics cards and everything like that, I was looking at them and I was saying, whoa, wait a minute. I was like, N64, PC, N64, PC, and I was like, the computer, the PC graphics in my visualization looked way better than N64. And not only that, the games, I was like, what are you playing, And we were playing Quake death matches, never mind this 4-player controller, little teeny 4-player screens on your little TV. You had a whole monitor yourself. Now you're hooked up to the internet, and then I'm starting to play with mouse and keyboard controls, and I'm like, wow, this is way better. I can do more things with it, and I can flick the controller, or you know what I mean? You can flick the screen left and right as quick as you can flick your hand, and there's no slowdowns anymore and everything like that. And I'm just like, this is way better in my mind. Now, that's pretty much what killed it for me. I was PC gamer after that, and like Diablo came out and everything like that. It was totally amazing time for that. That killed it. I was like, I'm done with this Fisher Price little Nintendo kids toy. Get this thing out of here, right? I'm big boy now or something, whatever. But the point is that my cousins who were younger than me, much younger than me, they didn't have the PC, they weren't into PC gaming or anything like that. So their first introduction to games that really wowed them were like Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and then especially I have to talk about GoldenEye. You can't talk about N64 without talking about James Bond GoldenEye, right? So that was their first introduction to first-person shooters at the time, right? But to me, like, they were raving about it, like this was the greatest thing ever, and it still confused me because I was just like, it is? Like, haven't you seen Quake or anything else on PC? This game is not the greatest thing ever. I mean, look at your characters, look like stickmen, they're very blocky. It's terrible slowdowns. The maps are super small. There's no internet capability. It's an awful game. To me, it's an awful game. I love that you love it, but not when you're playing PC games and you compared it to. It's impossible. So, and they were getting high and everything. Oh, let's get high and let's play, and shoot each other with GoldenEye, right? So I was never into it at that time. I never really did even like Zelda or Ocarina of Time. I know, kill me in the comments area. I thought it was one of the most boring games I ever played, and it felt very un-Zelda-esque to me, right? So they loved it at the time, but I think that's the point that I'm getting at, and that's why it has to be included in my retro video games list, even though some people may not consider it. I do, because of, if you were younger than me, God bless you, and it was the very first system that you had when you grew up as a kid. You opened it Christmas Day and you screamed, and it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you loved it. I love you. I love that you felt that way, because that's the way I felt way back in the day before you were even born with the other systems. And it's also the last system where you take a big cartridge and actually plug it into the top of it and hit that very satisfying clicking power switch on it, right? So everything else after that I don't consider, because it's all CD. The graphics got way better. You can even connect some of the systems now up to the internet and everything like that, and they still use, like I said in the beginning of this video, standard stuff that we still even use today, dedicated dual analog controls and all that kind of stuff. So the Nintendo 64 had to be included here. It is the last system in my playlist of me talking about all the retro systems, all the way from Atari 2600 all the way up to the Nintendo 64. And even though it sounds like I've been harsh on the system, I still love anybody who loved it and grew up with it and what it did for the industry. And I'm so glad Nintendo didn't go under because of it. I'm glad they didn't go the way of Sega and just start making some of their games on all of the systems and not making systems anymore, because now we got the Nintendo Switch, and who knows what Nintendo will come out with in the future as well. So they're still going strong, and and I thank the Nintendo 64 for that. So that's it. Thank you everybody for watching my entire playlist of retro systems that I personally played and my personal stories. Thank you. I love you. Hit the thumbs up button for the Nintendo 64 and all retro gaming systems that are absolutely fantastic. And if you want to see me talk about another one, click over here in the corner. And if you are a subscriber, thank you very much. And if you haven't subscribed, click that bubble over there in the corner, and I'll see you next video. Woohoo.